The earthquake hit without warning. Ethan Walker was halfway to the interview that could change everything when the ground began to shake. People screamed. Buildings groaned. And through the chaos, he heard her voice, desperate, fading. He looked at his watch. 15 minutes left. Then he saw her, a woman pinned beneath a massive concrete slab, her leg trapped at an awkward angle, dust and debris covering her clothes. Others ran past. No one stopped. He made his choice. He grabbed a piece of rebar, wedged it under the concrete, and pushed with everything he had. The slab shifted. Her leg came free. He knelt down, took her hand, and said the words that would rewrite both their lives. "I'm here. I won't leave you." Ethan Walker was 35 years old, and every morning felt like a quiet battle. He was determined not to lose. He woke at 5:30, made breakfast with practiced efficiency, and woke his 7-year-old son Noah with a smile that hid the weight pressing down on his chest. The apartment was small, 2 cramped bedrooms in a building where the heat barely worked and the walls were thin enough to hear the neighbors arguing at night. But it was home. And home was all Noah had. Ethan had been a structural engineer once. He'd designed buildings that stood tall against wind and time. Buildings that mattered. Buildings that would outlast him. But that was before the accident. Before his wife Maria died in a collision on a rain-slicked highway while he was working late. Too far away to do anything but receive the call. The call that changed everything. After that, the blueprint stopped making sense. The formulas felt hollow. The buildings he'd once been so proud of seemed like monuments to everything he'd lost. He took a job as a security guard at a mall just to keep the lights on, just to make sure Noah never felt the ground disappear beneath him the way Ethan had. It wasn't much. The pay was barely enough. But it was steady. And steady was all that mattered now. This morning was different. Today, Ethan had an interview at a mid-sized architecture firm. A real job. One that paid enough to move them somewhere better. Somewhere Noah could have his own room, and maybe even a backyard. Somewhere with windows that didn't rattle in the wind, and neighbors who didn't shout through the walls at 2 in the morning. He'd spent weeks preparing. He wore his only suit, the one he'd kept from his old life, pressed and cleaned until it looked almost new. He carried a leather portfolio that felt foreign in his calloused hands. Hands that had spent the last 3 years opening doors and checking badges instead of drafting buildings. Noah sat at the table, spooning cereal into his mouth and swinging his legs. "You look fancy, Dad." Ethan smiled. "Just going to talk to some people about a job. Nothing big." But it was big. It was everything. It was the difference between surviving and actually living, between making it through another month and finally breathing again. He kissed the top of Noah's head, reminded him to listen to Mrs. Chen next door, and walked out into the cold morning air. The subway station was crowded with commuters, all of them moving like a single organism, detached and hurried. Ethan stood on the platform, clutching his portfolio, and tried to steady his breathing. He went over his talking points in his head, his experience, his skills. The projects he'd completed years ago that still stood strong. He thought about Noah's face when he'd told him they might be able to get a dog someday. That's what this was for. Not for him, for Noah. Always for Noah. Across the city, Claire Monroe sat in a bookstore cafe, signing copies of her latest novel. She was 32, blonde, composed, and deeply, profoundly tired. The book was doing well better than expected. Her publisher was thrilled. Readers lined up to tell her how much her words had moved them, how they'd cried at the ending, how they'd felt seen in ways they'd never felt before. But Claire couldn't remember the last time anything had moved her. She smiled. She thanked them. She wrote inscriptions that sounded personal and heartfelt, but inside, she felt nothing. Her marriage had ended 2 years ago. Not with a fight, but with a slow, suffocating silence. Her husband had wanted children. She'd wanted them too, but after the miscarriage, something broke between them that neither could fix. He blamed her, though he never said it out loud. She blamed herself, though she knew it wasn't rational. They went to therapy. They tried, but eventually, They both realized they were trying to save something that had already died. Then came the realization that she didn't know how to feel anything anymore. She wrote because it was the only thing she knew how to do. But the words felt like echoes in an empty room. She wrote about love and loss and redemption, but they were just words on a page. They didn't touch her. Nothing did. She signed the last book, thanked the bookstore staff, and walked out into the afternoon. The sun was bright, the streets busy with people going about their lives. She walked slowly, in no hurry to return to her pristine, silent apartment. The apartment her ex-husband had never lived in. The apartment that was supposed to be a fresh start, but felt more like a mausoleum. She stopped at a crosswalk, waiting for the light to change, and thought about what she'd make for dinner. Probably nothing. Probably wine and silence, and another night staring at her laptop, trying to find words that meant something. Then, the world tilted. The earthquake was a 6.2, not catastrophic, but enough. Enough to crack sidewalks, shatter windows, bring down scaffolding and awnings, and anything not bolted to the earth. It lasted 23 seconds, but those seconds stretched into lifetimes. 23 seconds where the world stopped making sense. Where the ground, the one thing everyone trusted to be solid, became liquid and unpredictable. Ethan was at the subway platform when it hit. The ground bucked beneath him. The lights flickered and went out. People screamed and surged toward the exits in a panicked mass. Someone fell. Someone else trampled over them. Ethan grabbed an elderly woman who'd stumbled, steadied a young mother clutching her child, and pushed them toward the stairs. His engineering training kicked in. Assess, stabilize, move, identify the hazards, get people to safety. Don't panic. Never panic. He didn't think. He just acted. He made it to street level and saw chaos. Broken glass glittered on the pavement like diamonds. Car alarms wailed in discordant symphony. A fire hydrant had burst, sending water arcing into the air in a fountain that would have been beautiful in any other context. People ran in every direction, some with torn clothes, some crying, all afraid. A man stood frozen in the middle of the street, staring at nothing. A woman sat on the curb, clutching her phone, trying to call someone who wasn't answering. That's when he heard it. A voice, faint and desperate, coming from the wreckage of a collapsed awning near a bookstore. Help, please, someone. Ethan turned. Others kept running. They had places to be, people to find, their own survival to worry about. But he ran toward the sound, toward the voice that was getting weaker with every passing second. Claire was pinned beneath a concrete slab and a pile of bricks. The awning had come down on her as she passed beneath it, and she'd had no time to react, no time to do anything but fall. Her left leg was trapped, twisted at an angle that made her stomach lurch. Dust covered her face and clothes. She could taste it in her mouth, gritty and metallic. She tried to push the debris off, but it wouldn't budge. It was too heavy. Far too heavy. Panic clawed at her throat, making it hard to breathe. She screamed for help, but the street was emptying fast. Everyone was running. Everyone was trying to save themselves. And why wouldn't they? She was a stranger, just another person caught in the disaster. Then she saw him, a man in a suit, covered in dust, running toward her instead of away. For a moment, she thought she was hallucinating. No one ran toward danger. Not in moments like this. Ethan dropped to his knees beside her. I've got you. Hold on. Claire's vision blurred with tears and dust. I can't move. Don't move. Let me look. He assessed the situation quickly, his eyes scanning the debris with the practiced eye of someone who understood structural integrity, who knew where the weight was distributed, where the weak points were. The slab was heavy, but not impossible. Not if he used leverage. He found a broken piece of rebar, tested its strength, and wedged it beneath the concrete. He positioned himself at the optimal angle and pushed with everything he had. His muscles screamed. His hands slipped on the metal, but the slab shifted an inch, then another. Can you pull your leg out? he asked, breathless. Claire gritted her teeth and tried. Pain shot through her, sharp and blinding, radiating from her ankle all the way up to her hip. But she pulled. She pulled with everything she had. Her leg came free. Ethan tossed the rebar aside and helped her sit up. A scrape on her forehead was beginning to swell, turning purple at the edges. Her hands were shaking so badly, she couldn't control them. He took off his suit jacket, the jacket he'd cleaned so carefully that morning, the jacket that was supposed to impress the hiring manager, and wrapped it around her shoulders. "You're okay," he said, though he wasn't sure if it was true. "Help is coming. Just stay with me." She stared at him. This stranger, who'd stopped when no one else did, who'd risked his own safety for someone he didn't know. "Why? Why didn't you run?" He met her eyes. They were green, he noticed, a pale green that reminded him of sea glass. "Because I couldn't." Sirens filled the air, getting closer with every second. Paramedics arrived, moving quickly through the wreckage, triaging victims, calling out orders. Ethan stayed with Claire until they took over. He explained what had happened, how long she'd been trapped, what he'd done to free her. They nodded, professional and efficient, and immediately went to work. She tried to thank him, but the words wouldn't come. Her throat was too tight. She was lifted onto a stretcher, her vision swimming, and the last thing she saw was his face dirt-streaked, exhausted, kind. The face of someone who'd made a choice that most people wouldn't have made. "Wait," she called out. "What's your name?" But he was already walking away, disappearing into the crowd of first responders and survivors. Ethan checked his watch. The interview had started 10 minutes ago. His phone rang, cutting through the noise. It was the firm's HR manager. He stared at the screen for a moment before answering. "Mr. Walker, we expected you at 2. Are you still coming?" He looked back at the paramedics loading Claire into an ambulance. He looked at his hands, covered in dust and dirt. The knuckles scraped raw from the rebar. He looked at his suit jacket, now draped over a stranger who needed it more than he did. He thought about Noah, about the dog they'd probably never get, about the apartment with the broken heat and thin walls, about everything this interview was supposed to mean, everything it was supposed to change. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. Something came up. Someone needed help. There was a pause on the other end of the line, a long pause that told him everything he needed to know. "We can't reschedule, Mr. Walker. We have other candidates waiting. I'm sure you understand." "I understand." He hung up. His hands were shaking. Not from fear, from the weight of what he'd just given up. From the knowledge that he'd just made a choice that would cost him dearly. That would cost Noah dearly. But when he closed his eyes, he saw her face, terrified and pleading, her hand reaching for help that no one else was willing to give, and he knew, with absolute certainty, that he'd make the same choice again. 100 times over, he'd make the same choice. He caught a bus home, picked Noah up from Mrs. Chen's, and made spaghetti for dinner. Noah chattered about school, about a drawing he'd made of a dragon, about whether they could get a hamster if a dog was too expensive. Ethan smiled and nodded, and didn't mention the interview, didn't mention the woman, didn't mention the choice that would haunt him every time he paid rent, every time he looked at the overdue bills stacked on the kitchen counter. That night, after Noah fell asleep, Ethan sat on the couch and stared at his ruined suit, crumpled in the corner where he'd thrown it. He thought about the concrete slab, the dust, the rebar cutting into his hands, the way she'd looked at him like he was the only person left in the world. He thought about the interview he'd missed, the life he could have had, the fresh start that was now gone. He didn't even know her name. Claire woke in a hospital bed, her leg wrapped in bandages, her head pounding with a dull, persistent ache that made it hard to think clearly. The doctors said she was lucky, no broken bones, just deep bruising and a concussion. She'd be fine. She could go home tomorrow. They said it cheerfully, as if being fine was something to celebrate. as if fine was enough. But she didn't feel fine. She felt haunted. She kept seeing his face. The man who'd stayed. The man who'd knelt in the rubble and said, "I've got you." Like it was the most natural thing in the world, like stopping to save a stranger, was something everyone did. She asked the nurses if anyone knew who he was. No one did. He hadn't given his name, hadn't waited for thanks, hadn't filled out any paperwork or left any contact information. Just disappeared into the chaos like a ghost. Like someone who didn't want to be found. Claire was discharged the next day. She went home, poured herself a glass of wine, and sat at her desk. She opened her laptop and began to type. Not a novel. Not a story for publication. Just the memory, raw and unfiltered. She wrote about the earthquake. About the fear that had gripped her when she realized she was trapped. About the moment when she thought she was going to die alone on a sidewalk while people ran past her. About the stranger's hands, gentle and sure, pulling her from the wreckage when no one else would. She wrote until her fingers ached, until the words became something she could hold on to, something real and tangible in a world that had suddenly become very uncertain. When she finished, she stared at the document. 7,000 words. A complete short story. The most honest thing she'd written in years. Maybe ever. She titled it, Times, The Man Who Stayed. Asterisk. She sent it to her editor on impulse, not expecting much. 3 days later, they called. They wanted to publish it as a standalone piece, maybe even adapt it into an illustrated edition. There was something raw in it, they said. Something real. Readers would connect with it. Claire agreed. But every time she looked at the manuscript, she felt a pang of guilt. She was profiting from his kindness, turning his selfless act into something commercial. And she didn't even know his name. Didn't know if he'd want to be immortalized in her words. Didn't know if she had the right. Ethan returned to his life as if nothing had changed. He picked up extra shifts at the mall, worked nights to make up for the lost opportunity, stood at his post, and watched people come and go with their shopping bags and their ordinary problems. He smiled at Noah, helped with homework, read bedtime stories about brave knights and clever wizards. But something inside him had shifted in a way he couldn't quite explain. He kept thinking about those 23 seconds, the way the world had narrowed to a single choice, and how easily he'd made it. How instinctive it had been, how right it had felt, even knowing what it would cost him. He didn't regret it, but he wondered what it meant, what it said about him, whether saving one person was worth sacrificing everything else. One afternoon, he took Noah to a bookstore. Noah loved books, especially ones with dragons and wizards and magical worlds where ordinary people became heroes. Ethan browsed the aisles while Noah flipped through picture books on the floor, his small fingers tracing the illustrations. And then he saw it. A display near the front of the store. A small hardcover book with an illustration on the cover, a man in a suit, kneeling in rubble, holding the hand of a woman. The colors were muted, almost dreamlike, but the image was unmistakable. The title, Asterisk, The Man Who Stayed. Asterisk. Ethan's breath caught. He picked up the book with hands that suddenly felt numb, turned it over. The author's name was printed on the back, Claire Monroe. Her photo was there too, blonde, serious, familiar, the woman from the earthquake, the woman he'd saved. It was her. He opened the book and read the first page. It was him, the earthquake, the concrete slab, the choice he'd made without thinking. She'd written it all down, every detail. The dust, the fear. The moment when their eyes met, and she'd asked him why he didn't run. He read further, his heart pounding. She'd captured something in her words that he hadn't been able to articulate even to himself. The weight of the decision, the certainty that it was the only decision he could have made. Noah tugged on his sleeve. "Dad, can we get this one?" He held up a book about a dragon who was afraid of flying. Ethan closed the book carefully, set it back on the display. His hands were shaking. "Not today, buddy." He walked out of the store, his heart pounding in a way that had nothing to do with exertion. She'd remembered him. She'd written about him. She'd taken that moment and made it into something permanent. Something that would outlast both of them. But she didn't know his name. Didn't know where to find him. Didn't know that he worked nights at a mall to make ends meet. That he read the same 3 bedtime stories on rotation because those were the only books they owned. That he sometimes lay awake at night, wondering if he'd made the right choice. And maybe that was for the best. She'd moved on. Built something beautiful from the wreckage. He was just a character in her story now. A symbol of something noble and selfless. Better to stay that way. Better to remain a ghost than to become real and disappoint her. He went home and didn't think about it again. Or tried not to. But late at night, when Noah was asleep and the apartment was quiet, he sometimes wondered what she was doing, whether she ever thought about him. Whether she knew that she'd changed something in him too. Claire couldn't let it go. She tried. She wrote other things, attended other events, gave interviews about the book, lived her quiet, orderly life, but the man's face stayed with her, a constant presence in the back of her mind. She had to find him. She had to thank him properly. She had to know why he'd stayed when everyone else ran. What kind of person made that choice? What it cost him. She started with the hospital. They had records of everyone treated that day. She called, explained the situation, and was met with polite refusals. Privacy laws. Regulations. HIPAA compliance. She understood. But it didn't stop her. It couldn't stop her. Next, she contacted the city's emergency services. They kept logs of everyone who'd assisted during the earthquake, everyone who'd stopped to help before the professionals arrived. She filed requests, filled out forms, waded through bureaucratic delays. Weeks passed. Then, months. She was about to give up. To accept that some people were meant to remain mysteries. When she received a call from a fire department coordinator who'd been there that day. "I remember a guy," the coordinator said. "Pulled a couple people out before the paramedics arrived. Tall, brown hair. Looked like he'd been somewhere important. Wore a suit. Nice suit, actually. Expensive. He left before we could get his information. But one of the EMTs thought they saw him get on a bus heading east. It wasn't much. But it was something. A thread she could pull." Claire spent the next 2 weeks combing through public records, social media, anything that might give her a lead. She visited the subway station where the earthquake had started, showed his description to people who worked there, asked if anyone remembered seeing him. Most didn't. But one security guard remembered a man in a suit who'd helped people onto the street, who'd stayed calm when everyone else was panicking. He didn't know the man's name, but he remembered the face. And finally, after weeks of searching that bordered on obsession, she found a name in the emergency response records. Someone who'd been listed as a helper, but hadn't stayed for follow-up. Ethan Walker, age 35. Lived in a modest apartment building on the east side. Single father. Former engineer. Current security guard. She stood outside his building one evening, clutching a bouquet of flowers and a copy of her book. Her hands were shaking. She didn't know what she'd say, didn't know if he'd even want to see her. Didn't know if showing up like this was crossing some invisible line. But she'd come this far. She had to know. Had to understand. Had to thank the man who'd saved her life. She climbed the stairs, found his door, and knocked. Noah opened the door. He was small, bright-eyed, with his father's brown hair and a smudge of what looked like marker on his cheek. He held a toy car in one hand. "Hi," Claire smiled, caught off guard by how much he looked like Ethan. "Hi, is your dad home?" Noah turned and shouted over his shoulder. "Dad, there's a lady here." Ethan appeared in the doorway, wiping his hands on a dish towel. He wore jeans and a t-shirt, his hair slightly messy, his feet bare. He froze when he saw her. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Neither of them spoke. They just stared at each other. The recognition instant and overwhelming. "It's you," Claire said softly. Ethan stared. For a moment, he couldn't speak. His mind was racing, trying to make sense of her presence, trying to understand how she'd found him. Then, "How did you?" "I looked," she said. "I had to find you. I had to say, thank you." Noah looked between them, confused but curious. "Do you know her, Dad?" Ethan crouched down to Noah's level, his hand gentle on his son's shoulder. "Go finish your homework, buddy. I'll be right there." Noah hesitated, clearly wanting to stay and see what happened next, then nodded and disappeared into the apartment. Ethan stepped into the hallway, closing the door behind him. The space felt suddenly very small. "You didn't have to do this," he said quietly. "Yes, I did." Claire held out the book. Her hand was trembling slightly. "You saved my life, and I didn't even know your name." He took the book, looked at the cover, then back at her. His expression was unreadable. "You wrote about me. I wrote about what you did. About the choice you made." She paused, gathering courage. "I heard you missed something important that day. An interview. A job that could have changed everything for you and your son." Ethan's jaw tightened. He looked away. "It's fine. I'm fine. We're fine." "No, you're not." Her voice was steady, but her eyes were fierce with conviction. "You gave up something that mattered because of me. Let me help. Let me do something to make it right. I don't need charity." The words came out harder than he intended. "It's not charity, it's gratitude." She stepped closer. "Please. Let me buy you dinner. You and your son. Just once. Let me say thank you properly. Let me know the person who saved me. That's all I'm asking." Ethan looked back at the door, where Noah was undoubtedly listening, his ear pressed against the wood the way he always did when he thought Ethan couldn't tell. He sighed. He'd love that. Fair warning, he asks a lot of questions. "Good." Claire smiled, tentative and genuine. The first real smile she'd felt in months. "I like questions. Tomorrow night?" Ethan nodded slowly. Tomorrow. The dinner was at Claire's apartment, a spacious, warmly lit space that smelled like roasted chicken and fresh bread and herbs that Ethan couldn't quite identify. Noah was enchanted from the moment he walked in, running his fingers along the spines of books on the shelves, asking 1,000 questions about where she got them, which ones were her favorites, if she'd really read all of them. Claire answered them all with patience and humor, crouching down to his level, treating his questions like they were the most important things in the world. Ethan watched from the kitchen doorway, feeling out of place and strangely at ease all at once. The apartment was beautiful hardwood floors, tall windows, art on the walls that actually meant something. It was the kind of place he used to imagine living in, back when he was an engineer. Back when the future felt limitless. Now, it just reminded him of how far he'd fallen. They ate at the dining table, the three of them, and for the first time in years, the silence wasn't heavy. It was comfortable. Easy. Noah told Claire about his drawings, about school, about his teacher who let them have extra recess on Fridays, about the hamster he wanted to get someday. Claire listened, like every word mattered, like she had nowhere else to be and nothing else to do but hear about a 7-year-old's dreams. After Noah fell asleep on the couch, wrapped in a soft blanket Claire had draped over him, Ethan and Claire sat across from each other with mugs of tea. The apartment was quiet except for the distant sounds of the city outside. "He's wonderful," Claire said softly, looking at Noah's sleeping form. "He's everything," Ethan replied. "He's the reason I get up every morning. The reason I keep going." "Can I ask what happened? To his mother?" Ethan's hands tightened around the mug. The heat burned his palms, but he welcomed it. Car accident. 3 years ago. I was working late on a project. There was a deadline. I told her I'd be home by 8, but I wasn't. She was driving home from her sister's place. The roads were wet. A truck ran a red light. He paused, his throat tight. I didn't even get to say goodbye. By the time I got to the hospital, she was already gone. Claire's eyes filled with understanding and shared pain. I lost a baby. Miscarriage. 5 months along. We'd already picked out names. Already started painting the nursery. And then one day, there was no heartbeat. My marriage didn't survive it. We tried, but every time we looked at each other, all we saw was what we'd lost. They sat in the quiet weight of shared grief. Two people who'd learned that loss didn't announce itself with fanfare, it just arrived, unasked for and permanent, and changed everything that came after. "I'm sorry," Ethan said, and meant it. "Me too." They talked until late, about life and fear, and the strange, stubborn hope that kept them moving forward when everything told them to stop. About the moments that defined them, and the choices that shaped them, about what it meant to keep living when part of you had died. When Ethan finally carried Noah home, the boy's head resting on his shoulder, Claire stood in her doorway and watched them go. For the first time in 2 years, she didn't feel alone. Claire couldn't stop thinking about them, about the way Noah's laughter filled the room like music, about the quiet strength in Ethan's eyes. The way he looked at his son like Noah was the only thing in the world that mattered. She wanted to help, not because she pitied him, pity was too simple, too condescending, but because she saw something in him that reminded her what goodness looked like, what sacrifice meant, what it meant to choose someone else over yourself. She made a few calls. One of her closest friends, Amanda, was the HR director at a well-known architectural firm downtown. They'd been friends since college, had stayed close through marriages and divorces and everything in between. Claire explained the situation, left out the part about the book, made it sound casual, and asked if there were any openings. "Send me his resume," Amanda said. "I'll see what I can do." No promises, but we're always looking for good people. Claire got Ethan's information, updated his resume herself based on what she'd learned about his background, polished it until it shone, and submitted it without telling him. 2 weeks later, Ethan received a call. An interview. A real one. At a firm he'd only dreamed of working for. He was stunned at first, then suspicious. He looked at the email, read it 3 times, and felt something click into place. He called Claire. "Did you do this? I know someone there. I thought you deserved a chance, a real chance." His voice was tight, controlled in a way that told her he was angry. "I don't need you to fix my life. I'm not trying to fix anything. I'm trying to help. I don't want help. I want to do this on my own." He paused, and she could hear him breathing on the other end of the line. "I can take care of my son without your pity." Claire's throat tightened. "It's not pity, Ethan." "Then what is it?" She didn't have an answer, not one that would make sense, not one that wouldn't sound hollow. He hung up. For days, they didn't speak. Claire felt like she'd crossed a line she didn't know existed, like she'd violated some unspoken rule about help and pride and what it meant to respect someone's autonomy. Ethan felt like he'd been reduced to a charity case, like everything he'd worked for meant nothing if someone else had to hand him opportunities, like he was just another person who couldn't make it on his own. And then, it rained. It was a downpour, the kind that turned streets into rivers and made visibility nearly impossible. The kind of rain that felt personal, like the sky itself was angry. Ethan finished his shift at the mall and rushed to pick Noah up from school, but when he got there, Noah was gone. The teacher said he'd left with a woman blonde. Nice, said she knew the family. Panic seized Ethan's chest, cold and sharp. He called Claire, his hands shaking so badly he could barely dial. "Did you pick him up?" "Yes." Her voice was calm, steady. Exactly what he needed to hear. He was waiting outside in the rain. I saw him when I was driving by. He's safe. He's with me. I made him hot chocolate. Ethan exhaled, relief flooding through him so intensely it made his knees weak. I'm coming to get him. When he arrived at Claire's apartment, soaked and breathless, his shirt clinging to his skin, Noah ran to him. Dad! Claire made hot chocolate. And we're drawing. Ethan held him tight, felt his son's small body warm and safe in his arms, and had to fight back the urge to cry. Then he looked at Claire. She stood in the doorway, her expression soft and uncertain, like she wasn't sure if she'd done the right thing. Thank you, he said quietly. I'm sorry, You don't have to thank me. I do. He ran a hand through his wet hair, water dripping onto the floor. I'm sorry. For what I said. You were just trying to help, and I made it about my pride. I overstepped. I should have asked you first. No. He met her eyes. You cared. And I wasn't ready to let someone care. I've been doing this alone for so long. I forgot what it felt like to have someone who wanted to help. They stood there, rain drumming against the window, and something unspoken passed between them. Something fragile and real and terrifying in its honesty. I'm going to that interview, Ethan said. Not because you set it up, but because you're right. Noah deserves more than I can give him on my own. He deserves a life where I'm not constantly worried about making rent, where he can have his own room and books and maybe even that hamster he keeps talking about. Claire smiled, small and hopeful. He deserves you. That's already everything. Everything else is just extras. Ethan went to the interview. This time, he didn't miss it. He walked into the office in his clean suit, his portfolio in hand, and answered every question with the confidence of someone who knew what he was worth, who knew what he'd sacrificed, who knew what he was capable of. While he was there, Claire stayed with Noah. They drew pictures together. Noah sketched a house with 3 stick figures in front of it, carefully adding details like windows and a door and flowers in the yard. He labeled them in his careful, crooked handwriting. Dad. Noah. Claire. Claire stared at the drawing, her chest tight with an emotion she couldn't quite name. Hope. Maybe. Or possibility. Or the terrifying realization that she'd started to imagine a future that included them. When Ethan came home, he found them on the floor, surrounded by crayons and paper and the comfortable chaos of creativity. Claire looked up, hopeful and scared all at once. How'd it go? Ethan smiled. A real smile, the kind that reached his eyes. I got the job. Noah leaped up, cheering, his small fists pumping in the air. Claire stood, her eyes shining with unshed tears. I knew you would. Ethan looked at her, really looked at her, and realized something he'd been too afraid to admit. He didn't want her to be just a memory. He didn't want her to be just the woman he'd saved, the woman who'd written about him, the woman who'd helped him get back on his feet. He wanted her here, in this moment, in every moment. He wanted her in Noah's drawings and at his dinner table and in the quiet spaces between words. Stay for dinner, he said. Claire smiled. I'd like that. The job changed things. Not all at once, but slowly, steadily, like a tide coming in. Ethan moved them into a better apartment, nothing fancy, but with 2 bedrooms and windows that let in actual sunlight and neighbors who didn't fight at 2 in the morning. Noah got his hamster, a tiny brown creature he named Charlie, and Claire became a constant presence in their lives, woven into the fabric of their days in ways that felt both new and inevitable. She came over for dinners, helped Noah with school projects, her fingers carefully gluing together popsicle sticks, while Noah directed the operation like a tiny foreman, sat beside Ethan on the couch late at night, talking about everything and nothing, about books and buildings and the strange paths that led people to each other. They didn't rush. They didn't force it. They just let it happen, natural as breathing. One evening, Noah was decorating the new apartment with drawings he'd made at school. He taped one to the fridge, a picture of the three of them holding hands, standing in front of a house that looked suspiciously like the one he'd drawn before. The sun was shining. There were flowers. Everyone was smiling. Ethan saw it and felt something shift in his chest. A settling, like pieces falling into place. Claire stood beside him, her shoulder brushing his. "He's got you figured out," she said softly. Ethan turned to her. "I don't want to wait for another earthquake to realize what matters. I don't want to wait until something breaks to understand what I want to keep." Claire's breath caught. "I don't know what this is," Ethan continued. "I don't know what to call it or how to explain it. But I know I don't want to lose it. I don't want to lose you." Claire took his hand. Her palm was warm against his. "You won't." They stood there in the small kitchen, the rain tapping against the window like it had that first night, and kissed slow, tentative, certain, a kiss that tasted like hope and second chances and all the futures they'd thought were lost. Noah peeked around the corner, grinned wide enough to show the gap where his front tooth had been, and went back to his drawings. A year later, Noah opened the door to their apartment. Claire stood on the other side, holding a birthday cake decorated with 7 candles and a small velvet box that made her hand shake slightly. "Is this for me?" Noah asked, his eyes wide with the kind of joy only children can fully express. "The cake is for you," Claire said, smiling. "The box is for your dad." Ethan came to the door, saw her, and felt his heart stutter in his chest. They went up to the rooftop. Claire had planned a small party with a few friends. String lights strung between the railings, music playing softly from a speaker, laughter filling the air. Noah ran around with the other kids, his joy infectious, his laughter the soundtrack to everything good in Ethan's life. When the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and purple, Ethan took Claire's hand and led her to the edge of the roof, where the city stretched out below them like a blanket of lights and possibilities. "I have something to say," he began, reaching into his pocket. But Claire shook her head, laughing softly. "Let me go first. I've been practicing all day." She pulled out the small box and opened it. Inside was a simple ring silver. Elegant, understated, perfect. "You chose me in the earthquake," she said, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. "When everything was falling apart, when you had every reason to run, you stayed. Now, I'm choosing you, in the quiet, in the peace, in the ordinary moments that make up a life, in all of it." Ethan stared at her, stunned into silence. "Will you marry me?" she asked. He laughed, tears in his eyes, and pulled out his own ring from his pocket, a delicate band with a small diamond that had taken him 3 months to save for. "I was going to ask you the same thing." They both laughed then, the kind of laughter that comes from joy too big to contain, from the absurdity and beauty of two people having the exact same thought at the exact same moment. "Yes," Ethan said. "Yes," Claire echoed. They kissed as the sun dipped below the horizon, and Noah cheered in the background, waving sparklers in the air, his voice rising above the music and laughter. The earthquake had brought them together, but it was the quiet moments, the everyday choices, the small acts of showing up and staying and choosing each other again and again that made them a family. And as they stood there, holding each other beneath the fading light, surrounded by the people they loved and the life they'd built, they knew that some things weren't accidents. Some things were always meant to be. Some moments of crisis revealed who people really were. And sometimes the best thing you could do was stay when everyone else ran, because that's how you found the people worth keeping. That's how you built something that lasted.